Have you ever gone to church and then thought, what is going on in this place? You know, church today is not the same as it used to be, or at least it shouldn't be the same as what it used to be. The church today is one that often reflects something from the 1950s and 60s. Sometimes the church of today has integrated bands with drums and electric guitars and electric keyboards and more along the lines of professionals putting the music together than what we had in the good old days, as we often like to say, when choirs and handbell choirs were put together along with voices from every age in order to perform on a Sunday morning, giving our voices up to our Creator. Well, what do we do in reference to the church of 2014? We look at the way it's been done, we think about what's been done, and then we must ask ourselves, what can we do that's relevant? How can we make church a more relevant place to come to this day? Many people, in fact, in our world that we live in today, look at themselves and say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Well, the United Church of Christ recognizes that many people are indeed religious and spiritual. That's right, we acknowledge that people are both religious and spiritual, and that they can come together in one space to learn more about our Creator, the one who we call God. Well, one of the new ideas that I think churches are going to start to explore and that we need to explore is how to become more relevant in our day-to-day lives, and most importantly, when we take time for worship, how to become relevant at that moment in time. When you come to church, yes, there should be song, and I believe it should be well put together and well rehearsed. But I don't believe that it has to come from a band. I don't believe that it has to involve drums and electric guitars, but rather it could have an acoustic guitar. In fact, I believe that the music that we choose doesn't have to come from the 1800s and 1900s, but can come from our current artists who are singing and playing sacred music. Yes, I believe that sacred music is current music just as much as it is a Bach or a Beethoven piece. Current music says something about what is going on in the world. It speaks to what's happening in the world around us today, and therefore it is indeed relevant, and therefore it will help us as a church to become more relevant. I believe that we also need to look to Scripture and other pieces of literature. It could be something from a well-written new book, or it could be a piece of poetry that's been recently published. These pieces of sacred writings, as I like to refer to them, can be helpful to those in our communities to think about things that are relevant, to recognize that what I'm going through today might be different than what my parents or grandparents or even grandparents experienced in their life. Being current, being involved, and being relevant is what is the key, I believe, to church growth in the new millennia. I would like to see churches that stop putting so much effort into having all of the specifics of a worship experience being focused on, and rather take it moment by moment. Allow for the Spirit to move the congregation to sing a song or to pray out loud, to share some of the concerns. I also believe that the message, often referred to as the sermon piece, needs to be more relevant, and it needs to deal with people here and now. We need to engage one another in conversation, not just simply tell somebody what they should think or believe. The United Church of Christ is a denomination that believes in a God who is still speaking, and therefore is still relevant to today. And if we truly allow the other people who gather together in the room with a minister to voice their opinions, to share their fears and concerns, then I think we will find that we are becoming a more relevant church today. Again, I think that some of the ways that we have done church in the past have just become outdated. And therefore, when visitors come, people who are unchurched, those who are spiritual but not religious, enter into our church doors, they often find themselves asking the question, why do you keep doing the things that you have done? And they feel as if the church is just not relevant. Well, I think that we need to make a change, and it's time for that change now. We need to stop saying to ourselves, well, we'll plan it out and we'll get there in the next 6 months or a year. I think we need to be more relevant now. We need to stop thinking that it will come in the future and realize that the future is here. It's in this present place. You know, one of the great things that I love about reading the Bible is when I find something, a message that maybe has been missed or overlooked. Take, for example, the gospel lesson of Matthew. When we think in the Gospel of Matthew and the story about Jesus feeding the 5,000, what we need to recognize is that Jesus didn't just feed the 5,000, he fed them and their families. That's right. The 5,000 were just noted as men, but he also fed the women and the children, and that is noted in the Gospel of Matthew as well. In fact, this story about the feeding of the 5,000 extends past just Matthew. It goes into the Gospels of Luke, John, and Mark. The significance of feeding the 5,000, however, goes beyond that. If you thought about it when you read the book of Matthew and the story about feeding the 5,000, maybe you recognized right away that Jesus stopped on his journey. He was there along the Sea of Galilee or Galilee. And what he did was recognize that there was a need to stop and feed the people spiritually. So Jesus stopped along the lake shore there, along the seashore, and he took time with the people. He prayed with the people. He probably sang with the people. And then he fed the people. He performed communion. Well, what do we get when all of those things combine? We get church. But it's not church in the traditional way that we think about church. It was church that was relevant to today. You see, that's what Jesus was doing. He was doing church, but in a way that was relevant to what was necessary and needed at that time in history. See, if he would have created a building and put in stained glass windows and pews and all of the things that we have in many of our churches today, they may have laughed at him. In fact, they may not even have attended. But because he was with the people and among the people, and that because he recognized that church happens in a moment, in an instant, not in a planned time during the week, he became a relevant teacher, prophet, and guide for many of us and them in the world back then. So what do we do about this church that we currently go to and attend on a Sunday or Saturday or even during the week on a Wednesday? Well, I think that we again need to look back and recognize that Jesus saw the need for church to occur at different times. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't have church scheduled throughout the week. What I am saying is that we need to think about church more often in our lives. And we need to think about, maybe I need to come on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock and I need to worship. Well, even if nobody else comes with, then you can be there maybe with the pastor and you can have church. I think this is the importance of church and being relevant to today. If we can just set aside our preconditioned understanding of how church should function and operate. And if we can start to expand our understandings and our visions and begin to think outside of the pew, as I like to say, then maybe we can envision the church of the now or the church of the future. Maybe instead of sitting in pews on a Sunday morning that are often upright and uncomfortable for long periods of time to be sitting in, maybe we should have recliners and couches and love seats. And instead of feeding ourselves with all kinds of fattening goodies at the end of the service, maybe we should just simply shake some hands and go out into the world and share what we just learned and experienced with others. Well, these are just some crazy ideas that I have about what we can do with our church experience. In fact, I think that for many who have never been in a church, or for those who are spiritual and not religious, I think maybe what we need to do is think of a different way to approach having worship. One, I think we may not even want to call it worship. Maybe we should call it something like, modern experience of spirituality. Maybe that would be a better way to define it. And then we can just call it a mess. Not in a bad way, but we can reclaim that idea of what worship can look like. It's supposed to be a spiritual experience. It's supposed to be something that we all feel and that we all are left with hope and drive to help us to get through our week. You see, church shouldn't be all about the building. It shouldn't be all about the sweet treats following worship service. It should be about teaching our young about God as a creator. It should be about teaching them about Jesus as a guide and a prophet. And it should be about teaching them how to go out into the world and serve others. But this should also be the same thing for those who are the adults that attend, and for those who consider themselves to be the elders of the church. I think that we need to become relevant on all kinds of levels. And that means that when we get together and have this experience of spirituality, that what happens is that we listen to one another. We talk about something that's current and relevant in our modern day, whether it was just on the news that day or whether it was something from the past week that's been bothering us or been on our minds. You see, when we think about these things, when we talk and dialogue about our current issues in the world, then we become relevant because we're talking about things that are in the now, not things that are in the past. But it's also important, as Dr. James Cone would say, to look back on our experience and to reflect upon it and then use those reflections in order to help us and guide us on our current path. So in that light, I would say that if we can look back on what happened, biblically speaking, and then interpret it into what we can see going on in our world today, we might see some correlations between those events. But more importantly, we also might see how they handled the situation back then and how it came out, and therefore enlightening us as to how we might move forward in our day today, knowing what we know and experiencing what we experience. Well, I'm Reverend Damian J. Lake, and that's my thoughts on how we can become the current relevant church of the future.